Hey besties, welcome back to Maggie's Stories. Grab your tea. This one has scheming mothers, slow burn love, and a wedding in Kenya.
Maggie Nanyori was standing in the middle of her own cafe, holding a tray of mandazzi like it was a microphone, singing loudly, badly, gloriously, a worship song her grandmother used to hum while milking cows back home in Kajiado. "Thank you, Jesus," she belted, sliding the tray onto the counter with the confidence of a woman who had already seen the future. For favor, for increase, for a good man with a good job and baraka. Don't touch that. It's for the customers. For a wedding I did not even plan yet but I know is coming. Baraka, her head barista, a Korean-Nigerian boy raised 2 streets over from the cafe who called her Auntie Maggie, and meant it, froze mid-espresso pull. Auntie, Auntie, please look up. I'm praising God. Baraka. Let me finish dash. Auntie, turn. Around. She turned around. And there he was, Kang Tae-jun, standing by the door in a coat that cost more than her rent used to, holding a bouquet of tulips he had clearly panic bought at the flower stall outside, staring at her with the exact expression of a man who has just watched a woman thank Jesus for their unofficial, undiscussed, entirely in her head wedding. Behind him, peeking around his shoulder like a woman who had absolutely no shame about eavesdropping on her own son's love life, was his mother. The woman Maggie had known for 2 months as Madame Han, funny customer who orders extra chili and asks invasive questions. The woman whose face, Maggie realized in that exact frozen second, was the same face as Taejun's. Same eyes, same eyebrow that lifted when they were about to say something mischievous. Same everything. The tray of mandazzi Maggie was holding tilted dangerously. "Oh," she said quietly, to herself, to God, to the entire universe. "Oh no," because if that woman funny, loud, always ordering the special, even when there was no special, always asking Maggie if she had a boyfriend, a husband, any man at all, was Taejun's mother, then Madame Han had been coming into her cafe for 2 months not for the coffee. She had been coming for her. "Baraka?" Maggie whispered, not moving her lips. "Did you know?" "I've known for 3 weeks, Auntie. I thought you knew. Everybody in the kitchen knew. Nobody told me the customer who put pepper in my chai is my man's mother? You said my man. So you also already dash. Baraka, I am going to fire you and pray for you at the same time. Those are not mutually exclusive dash." Across the cafe, Taejun cleared his throat, still holding the sad, slightly wilted tulips, his ears going the particular shade of red that Maggie had, over 2 months, come to recognize as Taejun is about to say something he rehearsed badly. "I heard the last part," he said. "About the wedding." Maggie set the tray down with the dignity of a queen who refuses to acknowledge that her tray was, in fact, shaking. "I was praising God generally," she said, "as people do, in general, about general blessings. You said, a good man with a good job. That is a general blessing that many women want. Taejun, it is not. I was not specifically dash. You looked at my mother's photo on your phone screen while you said it. I could see the lock screen. That's a picture from her visit last week. The one where she's doing the peace sign." Silence. Madame Han, unable to contain herself 1 second longer, stepped fully out from behind her son, threw both arms in the air like a woman scoring a goal, and shouted, in English she'd clearly been saving for this exact moment. "Finally! I thought I would have to propose myself 3 months earlier." To understand how Maggie Nanyori ended up mid-worship song, holding mandazzi, caught red-handed planning her own wedding, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a Tuesday morning that started like any other Tuesday morning at Osachua Café. Osachua meant something to Maggie. It wasn't just a pretty word she'd picked because it sounded nice in a foreign country. Osachua was the cord, the sacred bond her people, the Maasai, believed connected 2 people who had shared something real. When a Maasai person needed help, they could invoke Osachua with almost anyone in the community, and that person was bound, by tradition older than memory, to help. It was mutual. It was permanent. It didn't expire because you moved to Seoul and started serving flat whites instead of milking cows. She'd named the cafe that on purpose, because from the day she opened it 3 years ago, With savings she'd built up doing everything from translation work to selling beaded jewelry to Korean fashion boutiques who thought Maasai beadwork was exotic and paid accordingly. She wanted it to be a place where the bond between her and her customers meant something. Where a stranger walked in a stranger and left somehow family. It worked. It worked too well. Some days, if you asked Baraka, who had to physically pry regulars away from the counter so Maggie could actually make coffee instead of hearing about someone's divorce, someone's promotion, someone's mother-in-law drama. Business was good. Better than good. The cafe took up the ground floor and half the basement of a building in a part of Seoul that had, over 3 years, slowly rebranded itself as the neighborhood with that cafe. Largely because of her. She had regulars who flew in from Busan just for her Saturday cooking classes, where she taught everything from injera-adjacent flatbreads to the specific, unteachable art of a proper cup of Kenyan chai, the kind boiled with milk and spice until it turned the color of good soil, not the pale apologetic tea Seoul usually served her. She drove herself to the wholesale market every Thursday in a car she'd paid for in full, cash, the year the cafe turned profitable, because her mother back in Kajiado had raised her to never owe a bank anything she could avoid owing. She lived in a penthouse 2 train stops from the cafe, modest by penthouse standards, loud by Maggie standards, full of beadwork and Maasai shuka cloth thrown over furniture and photos of her grandmother's cattle, because even in Seoul on the 40th floor, Maggie Nanyori was still a Maasai woman first. She was, by any measure anyone cared to use, doing well. And she was fun about it. She wasn't the type to whisper about her success like it was shameful. She celebrated everything. New oven celebration. Fully booked cooking class celebration. A customer telling her the chai reminded them of their grandmother, instant. Actual tears. Then celebration. Which is exactly the energy Madame Han Suyin walked into on that first Tuesday. Maggie remembered it clearly, because it had been unusual from the first 30 seconds. A woman in her 50s, dressed in nothing that screamed money. No logos, no fuss, comfortable shoes a woman wears when she intends to be on her feet all day being nosy. Sat at the counter instead of a table, which regulars did but strangers rarely did, and ordered whatever you'd feed your own mother. Maggie had laughed. My mother doesn't drink coffee. She'd want chai and an argument about how I'm dressed. Perfect, Madame Han said. Bring me the chai. I already have opinions about your dress. That was it. That was the whole spell. Madame Han came back Thursday, then Saturday, for the cooking class, where she was, by every account, the worst student Maggie had ever taught and the loudest laugher in the room, setting off the smoke alarm trying to fry mandatsi and then declaring, arms raised. It is burnt and yet I am still happy. This is the Maggie effect. She came every week after that. Sometimes twice. She asked questions no customer had any business asking. Was Maggie married? Had Maggie ever been married? Did Maggie want children? What did Maggie think about Korean men? Specifically, generally, hypothetically. Maggie answered everything with the easy humor she answered everything with, assuming the woman was simply lonely or nosy or both, and enjoying the company regardless. Madame Han was, objectively, one of the funniest customers she'd ever had. When Maggie told her, laughing, that she was very single. Married to this cafe, madam. The cafe is a jealous husband. Madame Han had nearly fallen off her stool laughing, wiped her eyes and said, with a straight face that Maggie should have paid more attention to, not for long. Maggie had thought she meant the cafe would eventually run itself. She had not understood, at the time, that Madame Han meant it as a threat. Promise. A declaration of war against Maggie's singleness that had already, unbeknownst to Maggie, begun weeks earlier. The day Madame Han went home from that very first visit and told her son, over dinner, completely unprompted, I found your wife today. She doesn't know yet. Taejun, for his part, had laughed at his mother the way you laugh at a woman who says something ridiculous every other week. He did not think much of it. He had, admittedly, gone quiet for a second when his mother described the cafe. The one with the tall woman, the beautiful one, the one who laughs like she means it, because something about that description snagged on a memory he hadn't examined too closely. He'd been to Osachua Cafe before, once, months before his mother ever set foot in it. He'd walked in for a meeting that got cancelled, ordered a coffee out of politeness because he didn't want to leave empty-handed, and had the singular experience of being served by a woman who looked at him. Not at his suit, not at the car outside, not at anything that usually got looked at first, and asked him, completely unbothered, long day or long life? He hadn't had an answer. He'd paid. left a large tip he hoped she wouldn't notice was large, and walked out feeling something he chose, very deliberately, not to name. He had not gone back. He told himself it was because he was busy. He was, after all, the heir to a company with more moving parts than he had hours in a day. A man who had been raised properly. His mother would say, though not without a certain irony given what she was about to do to his life, to be careful, to be kind, to never assume a woman's attention was owed to him just because of who his family was. So when his mother came home 3 months later and announced, with the confidence of a woman reading off a completed contract, that she had found his wife, Taejun laughed it off. Right up until she said the name of the café. By the time Madame Han finally convinced her son to accompany her to, just for coffee, just to be polite to mommy, Taejun had spent 2 weeks trying to talk himself out of the flutter in his chest at the mere idea of walking back through that door. He lost the argument with himself the moment he saw Maggie again, this time laughing with a customer about something involving a cow, gesturing with her whole body the way some people just talk, wearing color like other people wore neutrals, entirely herself in a way that made the whole cafe feel like it was orbiting her a little. He remembered exactly what he thought, standing frozen in the doorway that second time. Oh, it's her. Of course it's her. He did not know, yet, that his mother had already begun quietly asking Maggie for cooking lessons twice a week, not because she wanted to learn to cook. Madame Han had a full staff at home who could cook circles around her, but because it put her, twice a week, in close proximity to a woman she had unilaterally decided would be her daughter-in-law, with or without anyone else's consent. He did not know his mother had, that very week, texted 3 separate relatives a single photo of Maggie laughing behind the counter with the caption, "This is her. Don't tell Taejun I told you." He did not know that Maggie, who thought Madame Han was simply a hilarious, slightly unhinged regular, had started, without fully admitting it to herself, looking forward to Thursdays and Saturdays a little more than the rest of the week. All he knew, standing in the doorway of Osachua Café for the second time in his life, was that some part of him, quiet, stubborn, previously very well behaved, had already decided. It was going to be her. He just had 3 months of very slow, very funny, very poorly hidden falling in love to survive first. Saturday mornings at Osachua Café had a rhythm Maggie had built with her own 2 hands over 3 years. Tables pushed back, flour dust catching the light, 8 or 9 strangers who would leave 2 hours later calling each other by name. She loved Saturdays the way some people love church. Some weeks, honestly, it was her church. This particular Saturday, Madame Han arrived 20 minutes early, which should have told Maggie something. Regulars who arrived 20 minutes early were regulars with an agenda. "Maggie!" Madame Han called out, already tying an apron around herself before Maggie had even finished setting up the flour station. "Today my son is joining." Maggie paused mid-scoop, flour hanging in the air between them like a held breath. "Your son. The one you mention every single visit and never bring. He's busy. Important man. Very busy." Madame Han waved a hand like she was swatting away the very concept of busyness. "But today, not busy. Madam, with respect, I've heard about this son for 2 months. I was starting to think you invented him for content." "Content? Like a story? To make conversation?" Madame Han gasped, hand to chest, deeply offended on behalf of a son who did, in fact, exist and was, at that exact moment, walking through the cafe door looking like a man being led to a meeting he had not agreed to but no longer had the energy to fight. "There," Madame Han said, pointing at him like she'd conjured a rabbit from a hat. "Real. See? Real son." Maggie looked up, and there was the man from the coffee visit. The long day or long life man. Standing in her cafe on a Saturday morning in the exact expression of someone recalculating every decision that had led him to this specific moment, holding a small paper bag that turned out, she'd find out later, to contain a jar of honey he'd bought from a street vendor because his mother told him, "Never arrive at Maggie's empty-handed. She notices." "You," Maggie said, before she could stop herself. "Long day or long life?" Something shifted in his face, surprise. First, that she remembered, and then something warmer underneath it. "You remember." "I remember everyone who doesn't answer the question. Most people just say, long day. You just stood there like I'd asked something illegal. I was recalculating my whole life in real time. You caught me off guard. And did you ever find an answer?" He looked at her for a second longer than the question strictly required. "I'm still working on it. Behind them, entirely unsubtle, Madame Han mouthed something at the ceiling that looked suspiciously like a prayer of thanksgiving. The class that day was Mandatsi and Chapati Maggie's two most requested lessons, mostly because both were forgiving enough for beginners and impressive enough that everyone left feeling like a professional. She moved through the room the way she always did, correcting grips on rolling pins, laughing at burnt attempts, telling stories about her grandmother's kitchen back in Caggiato while flour rose in little clouds around her hands. In my grandmother's house, she told the room, working a piece of dough with practiced ease. If your chapati wasn't round, you didn't get to eat it. She'd just look at it, look at you and say, "Is this a chapati or a map of Kenya?" And then she'd feed it to the goats. The room laughed. Taejun, standing at the station directly across from her because his mother had very casually arranged the stations that way, produced a chapati so lopsided it genuinely did resemble a small, distressed country. "I don't know what this is," he admitted, staring down at it. "That," Maggie said, walking over, arms crossed, inspecting it with the seriousness of a food critic, "is a chapati having an identity crisis. Be gentle with it. It's trying. It is not trying. It has given up. Look at this corner." This corner said, "I'm done halfway through." Harsh. My grandmother would have fed this to the goats and then made the goats apologize to the flour. He laughed, a real one, surprised out of him, and Maggie felt an unreasonable amount of satisfaction about causing it. "Fine," he said. "Teach me properly, then, since apparently my dignity depends on it." "Your dignity left the building the moment you called this a chapati." She stepped in to fix his grip on the rolling pin anyway, one hand adjusting his wrist angle, the other flattening the dough beneath his palms, and if either of them noticed how close that put them standing, neither said anything about it. Madame Han, 3 feet away, pretending to knead her own dough while watching the entire exchange over the rim of her glasses, noticed enough for all 3 of them. By the end of the class, Taejun's second attempt came out round. Not perfect, round enough. "Look at that," Maggie said, holding it up like a trophy. "A whole map of Kenya gone. Now it's just a country with good borders." High praise. The highest I give. He watched her set it on the tray with the others, something settling in his chest that felt dangerously close to certainty. The visits didn't stop after that. If anything, they multiplied. Taejun found himself developing excuses to be in that part of the city. A meeting that could have been a phone call, a document that could have been emailed, a coffee craving that, if he was honest with himself, was never really about coffee. He and Maggie fell into a rhythm that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with 2 people who enjoyed making each other laugh more than either would admit. She teased him about his driver waiting outside like he couldn't be trusted to cross a street alone. He teased her about the extremely specific, extremely serious rules she had about tea. "You cannot rush chai, Taejun. Chai on rush is just brown water with regrets." And about the way she scolded customers who put sugar in before milk like they'd personally wronged her ancestors. "You have very strong opinions about tea," he told her one Thursday, watching her work. "I have strong opinions about everything. Tea is just the one you're currently violating. I haven't even ordered yet. I can see it in your eyes. You're a sugar-first man. It's a character flaw, but we can work on it. You've known me a month and you're diagnosing my character? I diagnosed it in the first 5 minutes. The tea thing is just confirmation." He leaned on the counter, arms crossed, watching her with the specific fondness of a man who had stopped pretending, at least to himself, that this was about coffee. "What else did you diagnose?" Maggie paused, kettle in hand, and considered him properly. Not the teasing kind of look, but a real one. "That you don't say what you're thinking until you've thought it 3 extra times. That you notice everything and comment on almost none of it. That your mother is the loudest woman I've ever met and somehow raised the quietest man." That's oddly accurate. I'm a professional. Chai reading. Like tea leaves, but with more attitude. "And what does the chai say about right now?" Something in his voice had gone quieter, more direct than their usual back and forth, and Maggie felt it land somewhere underneath the joke she'd been about to make. She set the kettle down instead of answering right away. "The chai," she said finally, softer than before, "says you should stop asking questions you're scared of the answer to." He held her gaze a beat too long to call it nothing. "Noted," he said. Working on my courage. Slowly. Slow is fine, Maggie said, turning back to the kettle before he could see whatever was on her own face. Slow chai is the best chai anyway. Madame Han, watching all of this unfold from the sidelines with the patience of absolutely no one, had reached the end of her tolerance for slow. They are being ridiculous, she announced to her husband that night, pacing their kitchen. Phone in hand, scrolling through the photo she'd secretly taken of Tae-jun laughing at something Maggie said. Ridiculous. Two grown adults, staring at each other like teenagers, and nobody says anything. Suyin, her husband said, not looking up from his paper. You cannot force your son to fall in love. I am not forcing. I am encouraging. There's a difference. You told your sister she's already married. She is already married. In my heart, the paperwork is just slow. She'd started, without telling anyone, quietly investigating what a Maasai wedding actually involved, reading about it late at night, sending herself notes, once accidentally texting her hairdresser a full paragraph about beadwork traditions meant for her group chat with her sisters. She learned that in Maasai culture, marriage wasn't just a joining of two people but of two families, of communities, that gifts and blessings flowed between them long before any ceremony happened. She learned about the significance of certain beads, certain colors, the role elders played in blessing a union. She did not yet know Maggie's family. She did not know Maggie's mother back in Kajiado, a woman with opinions as strong as her daughter's and considerably less patience for foreign in-laws who hadn't been properly vetted. She did not know that Maggie, for all her surface confidence, harbored a quiet fear that no man raised in wealth like Taejun's would ever fully understand a life that had started with cattle and dust roads before it became penthouses and lattes. All Madame Han knew was this. Her son laughed more in 1 month of knowing Maggie than he had in the previous 3 years combined. And a mother who noticed that kind of thing did not sit around waiting for slow to become certain. She was going to help it along, whether either of them asked her to or not. It was Madame Han's cooking class scheme that finally cracked things open. She'd started requesting private lessons. Just for me and my son, Maggie, he's shy in groups. A blatant lie that Maggie, strangely, didn't question, mostly because she'd started looking forward to those sessions more than she wanted to admit. One such evening, flour-dusted and half-finished with a batch of mandatsi, the three of them fell into an easy quiet, Madame Han humming something to herself while she helped by mostly getting in the way. Maggie, she said suddenly, not looking up from the dough she was mangling. Tell me about your home, Kajiado. What is it like? Maggie's hands stilled for a second, not from discomfort, but from the particular tenderness of being asked a real question by someone who actually wanted the real answer. It's wide, she said finally. That's the first thing. The sky doesn't stop. You can see weather coming from very far away. Rain, 3 villages over, and you know it'll reach you eventually. She smiled, working the dough again. My grandmother had cattle. Still does, actually, my brother manages them now. Cattle are not just cattle where I'm from. They're wealth, yes, but also trust, also family, also the thing that ties one homestead to another. You give cattle at a wedding not because you're rich, but because you're binding 2 families together. Osachua. That's what I named the cafe for. Tae-jun, quiet at the counter, was listening the way he listened to everything she said fully, like he was trying to memorize it. And the beads, Madame Han pressed, entirely too casually for someone who'd clearly done homework. Maggie laughed. You've been reading. Maybe. The beads mean things. Colors mean things. Red for bravery. Blue for the sky and water. White for peace and purity. My mother has a whole collar she only wears for weddings. It took her 3 months to make, sitting outside in the evening with my aunts, everyone adding a row. Her voice softened, somewhere between memory and homesickness. I haven't worn mine since I left. The kitchen went quiet for a moment, the good kind of quiet, the kind that happens when something true has just been said out loud. You'll wear it again, Madame Han said, with the total confidence of a woman who had already decided the outcome of several things that hadn't happened yet. I have a feeling, Maggie repeated, amused despite herself. Madam, your feelings are getting very specific lately. I am a specific woman. Tae-jun, watching Maggie across the counter, said nothing. But the look on his face said enough that even Madame Han, mid-sentence, had to physically stop herself from grinning. Madame Han had a plan. She would not call it scheming, she felt implied something underhanded, and there was nothing underhanded about a mother who simply wanted her son happy and had identified, with the precision of a woman who ran 3 household budgets in her head simultaneously, the exact woman who could do that. No, this was not scheming. This was strategy. Phase 1, the cooking classes, had gone well. Phase 2 required backup. "I'm bringing my sisters," she announced to her husband over breakfast, scrolling through her phone with the focus of a general reviewing troop deployments. "And Auntie Bora. And maybe Auntie Bora's daughter, the one who's good at reading people." Reading people for what? For confirming what I already know. That Maggie is perfect. I need witnesses. You need witnesses to fall in love with a woman on your behalf? I need reinforcements, Yango. There is a difference. She set her phone down, entirely serious. Taejun is slow. You know this. He thinks so much he forgets to feel. If I leave this to him alone, he will think about it, until he is 60 and Maggie has married a nice Kenyan man with better timing. Her husband, wisely, said nothing further and returned to his newspaper, the universal signal of a man who had long ago accepted defeat in matters concerning his wife's willpower. By the following Saturday, Osachua Café's cooking class had grown 3 extra bodies: Madame Han's 2 sisters and Auntie Bora, none of whom had the faintest interest in cooking and all of whom had come purely to observe, evaluate, and, in Auntie Bora's case, occasionally shout unsolicited commentary in Korean that Maggie, not understanding a word of it, assumed was about the dough. "She's tall," Auntie Bora said approvingly, watching Maggie demonstrate a folding technique. "Good hands. Look at her hands, Suyin. Strong hands make strong homes. I've been saying this for months." And she laughs from her stomach, not her throat. That's a real laugh. You can't fake a stomach laugh. "I know." Taejun looks at her like she hung the moon personally. "I know, Bora. This is what I've been saying." Maggie, catching fragments of enthusiastic Korean directed vaguely at her hands and her laugh, glanced over at Taejun with an expression that clearly said, "Your family is unwell, and I mean that with love." "They're evaluating you," he admitted, not even trying to deny it. "I apologize in advance for whatever they say next." "Evaluating me for what? I genuinely don't know." I stopped asking. "It's safer." "Taejun." Maggie set down her rolling pin, folding her arms, fixing him with a look. "Is your mother trying to marry me off to somebody? Because I have to tell you, if it's a cousin, I need a full profile first. Photos. References." Something flickered across his face: panic, humor, and something else underneath both that he wasn't quite ready to name yet. "Not a cousin," he said carefully. "Then who?" "That's a longer conversation. I have time. I own the cafe. I set my own hours." Maggie dash. Auntie Bora's staring at us again. "She does that." "Taejun, who is your mother trying to marry me to?" He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, the way a man does when he spent months rehearsing a sentence and every version of it has evaporated the moment it actually mattered. "Ask her," he said finally, weak, gesturing vaguely at his mother, and fled, actually fled, across the cafe, to go check on the honey, that needed no checking whatsoever. Maggie turned slowly toward Madame Han, who was suddenly, urgently, very interested in a chapati. "Madam." "Yes, Maggie? Who are you trying to marry me to?" Madame Han set down the chapati with the calm of a woman who had, frankly, been waiting months for this exact question. "Have you ever," she said, folding her hands like she was about to deliver testimony in court, "considered a Korean son-in-law?" "I don't have children, madam. I meant for yourself, as the wife. Have you considered being a wife to a Korean son, specifically?" Auntie Bora, unable to help herself, burst out laughing so hard she had to sit down. Maggie stared at Madame Han for a long moment. The pieces: 2 months of pointed questions, the cooking classes, the sudden appearance of an entire delegation of aunties evaluating her hands, clicking into place with the force of a dropped tray. "Madame Han," she said slowly, "have you been coming to my cafe for 2 months to scout me?" "Scout is an ugly word. What's the pretty word?" "Recruit." Madame Han beamed, entirely without shame. "I recruited you, for my family. You said yes months ago, You just don't remember saying it. I never said anything dash. You said yes with your face. The first day. I saw it. Maggie opened her mouth to argue and found, to her own irritation, that she didn't actually have an argument, because somewhere over the last 2 months, watching a quiet man learn to make round chapati and ask questions he was scared of the answers to, something in her had said yes, quietly, without her permission, exactly the way Madame Han described. This is insane, Maggie said, mostly to herself. Love is insane, Madame Han said serenely. Ask anyone. Taejun did not return from checking on the honey for a full 20 minutes, by which time the class had ended. The aunties had left in a triumphant, gossiping cluster, and Madame Han had made her own dramatic exit with a wink so exaggerated Maggie nearly threw a dish towel at her, which left Maggie alone in the closing cafe, wiping down counters, replaying the entire conversation with the specific irritation of a woman who has just realized she's been the last to know something everyone else already knew. Taejun found her there, 20 minutes later, hovering at the door like a man deciding whether entering was safe. Is it safe? Depends what you're walking into. Fair. He stepped in anyway, hands in his pockets, the paper bag of honey. The excuse nowhere in sight, which told her he'd genuinely just been avoiding her, not actually checking anything. My mother talked to you. Your mother recruited me, apparently. Past tense. Like I signed something. She has a way of making decisions on other people's behalf and considering it a gift. Does she do this often? Recruit women for you? Never. He said it plainly, without hesitation, and something about the certainty of it landed differently than the joking tone the whole conversation had carried until now. Never, actually. She's never done anything like this before. Which is, honestly, the part that worries me most. Maggie set down her cloth, giving him her full attention. Worries you how? Because she's not wrong often. He looked at her directly, finally. No more excuses to check. No more sentences to abandon halfway. She knew before I let myself know. That's the part one keep getting stuck on. The cafe had gone quiet in the way it only did at closing, the machines off, the street outside blurred and gold through the windows, just the two of them and several months of slow building something neither of them had said out loud yet. Knew what, Taejun? He took a breath. She watched him take it, watched the careful, thinking man visibly decide, for once, not to think it through 8 more times first. That I'd walked into this cafe once, months before my mother ever set foot in it, and left thinking about you for weeks afterward and not knowing what to do with that. That I came back because I told myself it was coincidence, and then kept coming back because it stopped being coincidence around the 4th visit. That every ridiculous thing my mother's done these past 2 months has just been accelerating something I was already too slow to say myself. Maggie stood very still. And what is the something? She said quietly. That you were too slow to say? He looked at her for a long moment. The same look from the very first day. The long day or long life day, except now there was no question mark on it. No hesitation dressed up as politeness. That I like you. Not the cafe. Not the mandazzi, though those are also excellent. You. I like you, and I've liked you for months, and I'm sorry it took my mother staging an entire recruitment campaign involving 3 aunties for me to actually say it out loud. Something in Maggie's chest, held carefully closed for months out of caution, because a man like this, from a world like that, didn't usually end up choosing a woman like her for real reasons and not novelty loosened all at once. You're very slow, she said, but softly, no bite in it at all. I've been told. I like slow though, she admitted, stepping a little closer. Close enough that the whole conversation dropped into something quieter, more private, even in the empty cafe. Slow chai, slow chapati, maybe slow men too occasionally, if they're worth the wait. Am I? Worth the wait? Maggie properly considered him. The quiet, careful, deeply unslick man who'd needed his mother's entire extended family to get him to a sentence he could have said in month 1. Ask me again, she said. After your mother stops planning our wedding without me. That might take a while. She's already looking into flights to Kenya. Of course she is. She asked me last week if Maasai weddings require a specific number of cattle. She wanted to know the going rate. Maggie laughed. The real one. From the stomach. The one Auntie Bora had correctly identified as unfakeable. and the sound of it, filling the empty cafe, settled something in Taejin's chest that had been unsettled since the day he first asked her a question about long days and got an answer he never stopped thinking about. "Tell your mother," Maggie said, still laughing, "that cattle negotiations come after the man asks properly, not before. Is this you saying yes to the asking, or yes to the eventual cattle negotiation?" "That," Maggie said, walking past him to lock the front door, throwing the words back over her shoulder with a smile she didn't bother hiding, "is for me to know, and your mother to find out approximately 4 seconds after I tell you." 2 streets away, in a car she had absolutely no reason to still be sitting in, Madame Han was watching the darkened cafe windows with the patience of a woman who had already, in her head, sent the invitations. "Well?" her husband asked, from the driver's seat, where he had been dragged under protest to just be nearby Yongo in case something happens. "Something happened," Madame Han said with immense satisfaction, watching 2 shapes linger a little too long by the door before finally separating for the night. "Start looking at flights to Kenya. I want to meet her mother before the year ends. Suyin. They haven't even Yongo." She turned to him with the calm certainty of a woman who had never once been wrong about this in 3 months of watching. "Trust the process." Maggie's mother, Nazirian, was a woman who had raised 4 children, buried a husband, managed a herd of cattle through 3 droughts, and had never once in her life been intimidated by anybody. She had certainly not planned on being intimidated by a small, extremely loud Korean woman standing in her compound in Kajiado, but by the end of Madame Han's first hour in Kenya, Nazirian was seriously reconsidering her lifelong record. "She has not stopped talking," Nazirian said to Maggie and Ma, watching Madame Han across the compound, where she was attempting badly enthusiastically to help pound maize with 2 of Maggie's aunts, narrating the entire process in rapid Korean that nobody around her understood and everybody found riotously entertaining anyway. "Does she breathe?" "Occasionally," Maggie said, between sentences. "Sometimes. I like her," Nazirian decided after another few minutes of observation, in the tone of a woman handing down a verdict from a great height. "She has no fear. A person with no fear either becomes very useful or gets someone killed. We will see which." "Mama, I am simply being honest." "It is a compliment, Maggie. Do not look at me like that." The 2 mothers had, against every reasonable prediction, taken to each other with an intensity that alarmed both their children. Madame Han had arrived in Kenya 3 days before the wedding with 2 suitcases entirely full of gifts she'd researched obsessively for months, and had spent her first evening in Kajiado sitting cross-legged by the fire with Nazirian and a translator app that mistranslated roughly a third of everything, laughing anyway at jokes she half understood, asking questions about cattle and beadwork and the stars with a genuine hunger to learn that even Nazirian's naturally suspicious nature couldn't hold out against for long. "Tell her," Madame Han instructed the translator app, pointing at a particularly striking beaded collar draped over Nazirian's shoulders, "that this is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen and I would like to know everything, absolutely everything, or I will not be able to sleep tonight." Nazirian, hearing the translation, allowed herself the smallest of smiles, the kind she rarely gave strangers. "Tell her," Nazirian replied, "that this collar took me 4 months to bead, that I made one exactly like it for my own wedding 40 years ago, and that if she truly wants to understand it, she should sit here quietly and watch instead of asking so many questions." Madame Han sat, quietly, for nearly 2 hours. It was, Taejun would later say, the longest recorded silence in his mother's adult life, and he had photographic evidence to prove it. The days before the wedding moved the way Maggie remembered wedding preparations moving as a child. Everyone busy, everyone loud, everyone somehow exactly where they needed to be despite no one appearing to be in charge of anything. Her aunts had descended on the compound the week before, beating late into the evenings by lamplight, adding rows to a collar that had begun, months earlier, as a single string Nazirian started the week Maggie called home to say, voice shaking with a happiness she couldn't fully explain over the phone, "Mama, I think I'm getting married." Every woman in the family had added something to that collar. Red beads for the courage it took to build a life and a business alone in a country far from home. Blue for the distance she'd crossed and the distance she'd be crossing again, coming home to close the circle. White, plain and simple, For the peace her mother said she could see settling over her daughter's voice even through a phone line, even from thousands of miles away. "You wear this?" Nazarian told her the morning of the wedding, fastening the collar around Maggie's neck with hands that had done this before. For other daughters, other nieces, generations back further than anyone could easily count. "And you carry all of us with you. Every woman who added a bead. Every woman who came before her. You understand this is not decoration." "I understand, Mama." "Good. Now stop crying. You'll ruin what your Aunt Sino did to your face, and she worked very hard on it. She'll never forgive you." Maggie laughed, wetly, and let her mother finish. Taejun, 3/10 over, was undergoing his own crash course in a tradition he'd spent months reading about and still felt entirely unprepared for. Maggie's brother, Lekishan, who managed the family cattle and had taken it upon himself to be Taejun's official chaperone for the week, found him pacing outside his tent that morning, adjusting and readjusting something at his collar for the 4th time. "You look like a man about to be interrogated," Lekishan observed. "I feel like a man about to be interrogated." "Relax. My mother already likes you. If she didn't, you would know. Believe me, you would know." "That's not entirely reassuring." "It's the most reassuring thing I can offer you, brother. Take it or leave it." Lekishan clapped him on the shoulder, steering him toward the gathering crowd. "Come. The elders are ready. Try not to trip over anything. There are children watching, and they will never let you forget it." The ceremony itself unfolded across the whole day, the way Maggie had explained to Taejun it would, months earlier, back in the quiet of the cafe after closing, patiently walking him through traditions he'd never encountered and clearly wanted, badly, to understand rather than simply perform. There were blessings from the elders, given in words older than either of their country's modern borders, invoking rain and cattle and children and long life in the same breath, as though all 4 were simply different names for the same abundance. There was the exchange of gifts between families, cattle, yes, negotiated for weeks beforehand between Lekishan and a visibly nervous Taejun, who had researched the going rate. As his mother put it, with the same intensity he brought to every business negotiation of his life, determined not to embarrass himself or, worse, insult a family he'd come to genuinely love. "You are overpaying," Lekishan told him at one point during negotiations with real affection. "But I will not stop you. My mother raised honest sons, not foolish ones." There was singing call and response that rolled across the compound in waves, women's voices rising and dropping in patterns Taejun couldn't follow but felt anyway, somewhere under his ribs, the way music sometimes reaches you before understanding does. And there was, at the center of it all, the adumu, the jumping dance, young men rising in turn, competing in pure joyful athleticism, height and grace both, the whole crowd cheering louder with every jump. Taejun, dragged into the circle by Lekishan over his own loud, laughing protests. "I don't know how to do this, Lekishan. I will embarrass your entire family." Jumped anyway. Badly, gracelessly, arms flailing in a way that had absolutely nothing in common with the smooth, powerful jumps of the men around him. And the entire crowd, Maggie included, laughed so hard several people had to sit down. That, Maggie told him later, breathless from laughing, wiping actual tears from her eyes, was the worst jump I have ever witnessed in my life. I gave it everything I had. That's the tragedy of it. This was your best effort. Your brother said I did well. My brother was being polite. He is a very polite man. I am not obligated to be polite. I am your wife. You're not my wife yet, technically. The ceremony isn't finished. I decided an hour ago. The paperwork is just slow. She grinned, echoing his own mother's words from months earlier without even realizing it, and something about hearing his own family's chaos come back to him in Maggie's mouth. In this place, surrounded by her family's chaos too, felt like the exact moment everything had actually, finally, arrived. Madame Han cried through most of the final blessing, loudly, unapologetically, dabbing at her face with a handkerchief while narrating her own emotional state to anyone nearby who would listen. I am not sad, she announced to Nazarian, to Auntie Bora who had insisted on making the trip, to a small child who had wandered over out of curiosity and gotten more of an answer than she'd bargained for. These are happy tears. I have been planning this for 8 months. 8 months. Nobody believed me. I believed you, Nazarian said. arriving at Madame Han's side with the ease of a woman who, over one short week, had gone from cautious skepticism to something dangerously close to real friendship. From the day you told me the story of the Mandazzi and the goats, I knew then you would not stop until this happened. You understood me from the first story? I understood you were a woman who does not know how to give up on something she wants. I recognized it. I am the same. The two women, from two entirely different worlds, watched their children together under a Kenyan sky neither had expected to stand under a year earlier, and toasted Madame Han with imported champagne she'd insisted on bringing. Nazirian with a cup of chai brewed the proper way, slow, patient, no rushing, to a wedding neither of them had technically been asked to plan, and both of them had planned anyway. To Osachua, Madame Han said, raising her glass, mangling the pronunciation slightly and not caring in the least. The chord. I looked it up. I like it very much. To Osachua, Nazirian agreed. The bond that does not break, even across oceans, even between two families who did not know each other existed a year ago. Across the compound, under string lights strung between the trees by Baraka, who had flown in specifically to see this and had spent the whole week insisting to anyone who'd listen that he'd known it from day one. I called it, everyone in the kitchen knew. Maggie and Taejun stood together, her collar catching the last of the sunset light, his terrible dancing thoroughly forgiven, both of them laughing about something neither of them would remember the specifics of years later, only that they were laughing together, exactly the way this whole story had started months ago, over a lopsided chapati and a question about long days. So, Taejun said, once the crowd had thinned and the fires were low and it was just the two of them again, the way it so often had been back at the cafe after closing. Long day or long life? Maggie considered the question properly this time, the way she never quite had that first day, watching the fire, her family and his family tangled together across the compound like they'd always belonged there. Long life, she said finally. Definitely long life. Very long. With lots more terrible dancing. I'll practice. Please do. For the sake of our future children's dignity. Our future children, he repeated, testing the words, grinning. Don't get ahead of yourself. We just finished the wedding. Your mother's already asked when the cattle for the next negotiations start. Of course she has. So has mine, actually. They've exchanged numbers. I think they're planning something. Maggie groaned, laughing, dropping her head onto his shoulder as the fire crackled on and their two mothers, 3 tents away, huddled together over a phone screen, already scrolling through baby names in 2 languages neither of them fully spoke, utterly delighted with themselves and the whole impossible, funny, wonderful mess they'd started.
Hey besties, in this story we learned that love often grows through kindness, laughter, and genuine respect rather than grand gestures. When two families embrace each other's cultures with open hearts, differences become strength instead of barriers. Real happiness comes from building relationships founded on trust, patience, and the willingness to learn from one another. Thank you so much for watching. Kindly like, subscribe, and share. And sorry, besties, I'll be well soon and the stories will be more sweeter. Thank you for your support. I love you all.